The phone buzzed again in Marcus's pocket, the vibration sharp against his numb thigh. He ignored it. His fingers were stiff from the cold, wrapped around a chipped Starbucks cup that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. Below him, headlights crawled along the road like slow insects. Someone laughed from the sidewalk and pointed up. "Hey, Tarzan!" a voice shouted. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and stared at the gray winter sky, wondering how his life had ended up 20 feet above the ground in a bare oak tree, while the rest of the world kept moving like he wasn't even there. The tree stood on the edge of a public park in Columbus, Ohio, wedged between a commuter road and a quiet neighborhood of split-level homes. In summer, families spread blankets there. In winter, it was mostly empty, except for dog walkers who kept their heads down and their hands in their pockets. The oak was old, thick, and stubborn. Marcus liked that about it. He hadn't always lived there. A year earlier, Marcus Reed had an apartment with beige walls and bad water pressure. It wasn't special, but it was his. He worked inventory at a regional warehouse, 10-hour shifts under buzzing fluorescent lights. The pay wasn't great, but it covered rent, gas, and the occasional takeout burrito when he was too tired to cook. He had a girlfriend named Alyssa who liked candles and true crime podcasts. They talked about getting a dog someday. Then the warehouse downsized. At first, Marcus told himself it was temporary. He burned through his savings slower than he expected, counting every dollar like it might multiply if he stared long enough. Alyssa tried to be patient, but patience has a way of thinning out when bills don't stop coming. Conversations turned into arguments. Arguments turned into long silences. One night, she packed a bag and said she needed space, which Marcus understood was another word for ending. The eviction notice came in a plain white envelope. No drama. No yelling. Just dates and numbers and a signature at the bottom. Marcus slept in his car for a while, parked behind a closed grocery store. When the car was finally repossessed, it felt less like a loss and more like confirmation. He tried shelters, but the noise made his chest feel tight. The feeling of being watched never went away. So he drifted. The tree wasn't a plan. It was a last option. At first, people thought it was a joke. A guy in his mid-30s, beard untrimmed, climbing a tree with a backpack and a sleeping bag. Someone posted a photo online. The comments came fast. Memes. Jokes. Speculation. A few people said he must be high or crazy. Marcus didn't see any of it, but he felt it anyway in the way people stared, the way phones came out when they thought he wasn't looking. The cold was the hardest part. Ohio winters don't mess around. The wind cut through layers like they weren't there. His hands cracked. His knees ached constantly. At night, when the park was empty, fear crept in quietly. Not fear of falling, but fear of being completely forgotten. Still, there was something about being up there. From the branches, Marcus could see rooftops glowing warm with indoor lights. He could hear TVs, muffled laughter, the clink of dishes. It hurt, but it also reminded him that life still existed, even if he wasn't part of it right now. Sometimes he wondered if he deserved this. If every bad choice he'd made had led him here, one step at a time. Other times, he felt angry. Not explosive anger, but the slow, heavy kind that sat in his chest and made it hard to breathe. Most days, people ignored him. Some mocked him. A few shouted advice he didn't ask for. No one asked his name. And Marcus, curled up against the trunk of that old oak, started to believe that maybe being unseen was easier than hoping someone would actually look closer. The woman showed up on a Tuesday morning, just after a week's snow started falling. Marcus noticed her because she didn't look away. Most people glanced up, smirked, then kept walking. She stopped at the edge of the park with a paper bag in one hand and her phone in the other, like she wasn't sure what to do with either. She wore scrubs under a heavy coat, hospital badge still clipped to her chest. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, the kind that said she'd stopped caring sometime around hour 10 of a long shift. "You okay up there?" she called out. Marcus hesitated. People asked questions all the time. They never waited for answers. "I'm fine," he said finally. His voice sounded rough, like he hadn't used it enough. She nodded, like she believed him, which caught him off guard. Then she held up the bag. "I've got an extra breakfast sandwich. If you want it." He almost said no. Saying no had become automatic. Pride mixed with habit. But his stomach tightened just looking at the bag. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she replied, still offering. She set the bag on a bench and stepped back, hands raised slightly, like she didn't want to scare him. The small gesture did something to him. It felt respectful. Human. After she left, Marcus climbed down slowly, joints stiff, boots slipping slightly on the bark. The sandwich was still warm. He sat on the bench and ate it carefully, like it might disappear if he rushed. The next day, she came back. This time it was coffee. Black. No lid. "I figured you might not like cream," she said, shrugging. "Why?" Marcus asked. She smiled a little. "Just a guess." Her name was Elena. She worked nights at a nearby hospital as a respiratory therapist. She didn't ask how he ended up in the tree. She didn't ask what went wrong. She talked about the weather, about how tired she was, about how her apartment heater barely worked. Normal things. Marcus found himself answering questions without realizing it. Simple ones at first. Where he was from. How long he'd been there. He left out the worst parts. She didn't push. Days turned into a quiet routine. Elena stopped by after her shifts when she could. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she just stood and talked while Marcus stayed in the tree, his legs dangling. She never took photos. Never pulled out her phone unless she got a call. Once, a group of teenagers walked past and laughed. One of them shouted something about survival shows. Marcus felt his face burn. Before he could shrink back, Elena turned and looked straight at them. "Grow up," she said flatly. They didn't expect it. They mumbled something and walked off. Marcus stared at her. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said. "People forget there's a person involved." That night, Marcus lay awake longer than usual. Not because of the cold, but because something inside him felt unsettled. For months, he had told himself he didn't need anyone. That needing people was what got him hurt in the first place. But Elena hadn't tried to save him. She hadn't offered a miracle. She just showed up. A week later, she asked him a question he wasn't ready for. "Have you thought about getting help?" she said gently. He stiffened. "I don't need charity." "I didn't say charity," she replied. "I said help. There's a difference." He wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. Help meant admitting this wasn't temporary. It meant accepting that climbing down wasn't weakness, even if it felt like it. "I don't fit anywhere," Marcus said finally. "I've tried." Elena nodded slowly. "I believe you. But that doesn't mean you never will." She told him about her brother, how he'd slept on her couch for months after a divorce, angry at the world, ashamed to be seen. How he'd pushed everyone away until one day he didn't. Not because life got easy, but because staying stuck hurt more than trying again. Marcus listened without interrupting. He noticed how she didn't make the story about lessons or inspiration. It was just something that happened. Later that evening, Marcus checked his phone. The battery was almost dead. He scrolled through missed notifications he'd ignored for weeks. One voicemail stood out. A number he hadn't saved. It was from a staffing agency he'd applied to months ago. "Marcus, this is Jen from Horizon Logistics. I know it's been a while, but we had a spot open up. If you're still interested, give me a call back." His chest tightened. He stared at the screen until it went dark. Opportunity scared him more than the cold. Opportunity came with expectations. With the risk of failing again. The next morning, Elena noticed he seemed distracted. "You okay?" she asked. "There's a job," he said quietly. "Maybe." She smiled, not wide, not dramatic. That's something. It might be too late, he said. Maybe, she agreed. Or maybe it's just late. When she left, Marcus stayed in the tree longer than usual, staring at the empty park. The oak creaked softly in the wind. He pressed the phone to his ear and listened to the voicemail again. For the first time in months, the idea of climbing down didn't feel impossible. Just terrifying. And sometimes, he realized, terrifying was still better than staying frozen in place. Marcus didn't call the number right away. He told himself it was because the phone battery was low, or because it was too cold to think straight. But deep down, he knew the truth. Calling back meant stepping out of the narrow space he'd learned to survive in. It meant letting someone expect something from him again. That night, the temperature dropped into the teens. The wind rattled the bare branches, making the whole tree groan like it was tired of holding him. Marcus lay curled in his sleeping bag, eyes open, counting his breaths. His toes burned, then went numb. He flexed them over and over, afraid of what would happen if he stopped feeling them. He thought about the warehouse. About the steady rhythm of scanning boxes, the dull predictability of it. He thought about Alyssa's face the last time she looked at him, tired more than angry. He thought about how easy it had been to tell himself that losing everything meant he didn't have to try anymore. Around 3 in the morning, his phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. It was from Elena. Just got off shift. Roads are bad. You okay? He stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. His fingers shook, partly from the cold, partly from something else. I don't know. She responded almost immediately. Do you want company? No, he typed, then erased it. He tried again. I don't want to be a problem. There was a pause. Then, you're not. The words hit him harder than he expected. His throat tightened. He pressed the phone against his chest and let out a slow breath that turned into something dangerously close to a sob. He hadn't cried since before the eviction. Crying felt indulgent, like something he hadn't earned. The next morning, the park was quiet in a heavy, snow-muted way. Marcus climbed down to stretch his legs. As he stood there, dizzy and stiff, he noticed a laminated notice zip-tied to the park sign. City Ordinance. No loitering or camping in public parks. Violators subject to removal. His stomach dropped. He had known this was coming. He just hadn't wanted to see it written out so clearly. The tree had felt permanent because he needed it to be. But it never was. A police cruiser rolled by slowly. It didn't stop. Not yet. Still, the message was clear. Time was running out. Elena showed up later that afternoon, her face tight when she saw the notice. They're going to make you leave, she said. I know. Do you have anywhere to go? He shook his head. Saying it out loud made it feel final. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. I've got a couch. It's not big, and I snore. But it's warm. Marcus stepped back like she'd offered him something dangerous. I can't, he said quickly. That's too much. Marcus, she said softly, you're freezing in a tree. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. I chose this. Did you? She asked. Or did you just stop choosing anything else? The question stuck with him after she left. He climbed back up, heart pounding harder than the effort justified. The wind picked up again, cutting through him. He hugged his knees and stared at the road. He thought about pride. How it had once meant working hard, paying his own way, not asking for help. Somewhere along the line, pride had turned into isolation. A refusal to be seen struggling. That afternoon, his phone died completely. With no distractions, the thoughts came faster. What if he went to Elena's place and never left? What if he took the job and failed again? What if this really was as good as it got? As the sky darkened, the cold became unbearable. His hands cramped. His jaw ached from clenching. For the first time since he'd climbed that tree, Marcus felt real fear. Not abstract fear. Not future fear. Fear that his body might simply give up before his pride did. He climbed down awkwardly, almost slipping. His legs barely held him. He sat on the frozen ground, back against the trunk, and stared at the empty park. This was the breaking point. Not dramatic. Not public. Just a man realizing that holding on was starting to look a lot like giving up. Marcus walked to the nearest gas station and asked to use the charger behind the counter. The cashier barely looked at him as she nodded. When his phone powered back on, he didn't scroll. He didn't overthink. He called the staffing agency first. Left a message. His voice cracked halfway through, but he finished. Then he called Elena. She answered on the second ring. "Hey. I can't do this anymore," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I don't want to disappear." There was a pause. Then her voice, steady and real. "Okay. Come over." Marcus hung up and stood there, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee. His hands were still shaking, but something inside him had shifted. Climbing down had hurt. Letting go always did. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't doing it alone. Elena's apartment was smaller than Marcus expected. A second-floor walk-up above a dentist's office, with thin walls and a radiator that hissed like it had opinions. The couch sagged in the middle. There were mismatched mugs in the sink, and a folded blanket already laid out, like she'd planned this without admitting it to herself. "This is temporary," Marcus said, standing awkwardly near the door, backpack still on. "Everything is," Elena replied. "Even the bad parts." That first night, Marcus barely slept. Not because he was uncomfortable, but because he wasn't. Warmth felt unfamiliar. The quiet was different too. No wind. No creaking branches. Just the distant hum of traffic and the radiator clicking on and off. He lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for the feeling to disappear. It didn't. The next morning, Elena left for another shift, scribbling a number on a sticky note and sticking it to the coffee table. "Call them again," she said, nodding toward it. "And eat something. There's soup." Marcus nodded. He didn't trust himself to say anything yet. The call came back that afternoon. A short-term position. Early mornings. Nothing glamorous. But it was work. Real work. He thanked the woman on the phone too many times, his voice catching at the end. His first day, he stood in the warehouse bathroom staring at his reflection. He looked thinner. Older. His beard uneven. But his eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. He washed his face, took a breath, and walked out. The work was hard in a familiar way. Heavy boxes. Concrete floors. A supervisor who barely remembered his name. But there was comfort in routine. In knowing where to be and what to do. In earning something, even if it was just the right to feel tired for a reason. Elena never acted like she'd rescued him. She didn't check in constantly. She didn't tell other people his story. At night, they ate simple meals and watched whatever was on. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Marcus learned that quiet didn't always mean loneliness. A week later, they drove past the park together. The oak tree stood the same as always, bare and steady. The branch where Marcus used to sleep was empty. "You okay?" Elena asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so." He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel healed. There were still moments when shame crept in unexpectedly. When he caught his reflection in a window and remembered how close he'd come to vanishing. But those moments passed. Not because he forced them away, but because there were new ones now. A paycheck. A warm place to sit. A person who knew his name and used it. Marcus moved into a small studio apartment 2 months later. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and old carpet. He bought a cheap folding chair and ate dinner on the floor the first night. It felt ridiculous and perfect. On his wall, he taped the sticky note with the staffing agency number. Not because he needed it anymore, but because he wanted to remember the moment he decided to call. People still talked about the tree guy online for a while. The story lost steam. Something always replaced it. Marcus never corrected anyone. He didn't need to. What shocked people wasn't that he left the tree. It was that he stayed human while he was up there. That he accepted help when it finally came. That he didn't turn bitterness into an identity. One evening, months later, Marcus walked through the park on his way home from work. The oak tree loomed quietly in the fading light. He stopped for a moment, resting a hand against its rough bark. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel embarrassed. He felt grateful. Grateful that someone had looked up instead of away. Grateful that he'd found the courage to climb down. Grateful that life hadn't magically fixed itself, but had given him just enough space to try again. Marcus kept walking, hands in his pockets, breath visible in the cold air. The world didn't applaud. Nothing dramatic happened. But somewhere inside him, something settled. Sometimes, getting better doesn't look like winning. Sometimes it just looks like staying. And for Marcus, that was more than enough.